Cool. So hello and welcome to the Quidditch Stats webinar panel. So this week, we'll just wait a couple of seconds for people to join in. And so we'll start by Jay. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, everyone. So my name's Jay Holmes. I'm the current head coach of the United Kingdom national Quidditch team. I'm also the captain of Velociraptors Quidditch Club. I also am a board member for Quidditch Europe and have held a myriad of other positions in UK Quidditch and European Quidditch.
Cool. Ethan?
I'm Ethan Sturm, co-commissioner of Major League Quidditch. Closer to the pitch, I'm also assistant coach for the U.S. national team and the head coach of the Harvard Horntails. More applicable to this panel, I founded the Eighth Man almost a decade ago now, and more recently I've been doing work on the Midline, which is a more analytics-based YouTube channel. That's me.
Okay, Rags?
Yeah, my name is Raghu Achikola. I go by Rags. I'm the gameplay director for Major League Quidditch, but I've also done a lot of work in Quidditch analytics and Quidditch analysis for the Eighth Man.
Okay, Amanda?
Hey everyone, I'm Amanda Michaels. I'm the statistics manager for Major League Quidditch.
Adam?
And my name's Adam Davis. I am a co-founder of a stats package with Sam Burkett himself. But outside of this, I have been the head of football at the University of York in the UK, and I'm currently a data analyst for Sheffield United Football Club.
Cool. I'm the moderator for this, Sam Burkett, and I'm player at Velociraptors. And with Adam, I've started making the stats package. So if we'll begin, so how are analytics used in Quidditch currently, Jay?
So I think analytics has only just started to gain providence in European Quidditch. At the moment, the thing we mainly see is your really obvious statistics. So we see goal scorers, we see assists, we see very, very basic stats like game time, and occasionally something that's like how long it's taken a team to catch a snitch. But especially in Europe, stats is really in its infancy. And apart from those obvious stats that you can basically rip straight off a score sheet or by putting some, basic formula into a spreadsheet, we don't actually see it used a great deal. And I know we're going to be talking about how we've used stats at the moment, but I think in Europe, stats is definitely something that we've not seen taken very seriously outside of the likes of QPL, where the most interesting stat we're given is goal scorers and assists. And we were supposed to be impressed that was some sort of revolutionary stat, whereas we're hoping from this panel to maybe take stats in a different direction.
Okay, Rags, you got anything to add?
Yeah, so I think one of the problems in American Quidditch is just the size of it. So MLQ does a good job, and Amanda can talk more about the stats that we track, but even those only really work because we work with a very contained set of teams. It's very easy for people to become sort of like experts on the roster and sort of experts in taking stats. Outside of that USQ, when I go to tournaments, I try to take stats as much as I can. But other than that, there's no real centralized stat taking capability there. So we're definitely also still in our infancy.
Okay, Amanda, do you want to talk more about that in the MLQ side?
I think that what Rag said is accurate as far as it takes experience. It takes experience with the teams. If I'm familiar with the team, I could track one or maybe two at a time versus if I'm not, it's super hard, and it's really hard to get volunteers to do that when they're not familiar with the stats that we're taking or the teams that they're trying to track. So it's tough to get general volunteers to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning that when Rag says it's easier for MLQ than maybe like a USQ season where you have 200 teams, you have tournaments all over the country happening on the same days. I mean, we still never had a season where we had every MLQ stat on the books at the end of the season. So when we say it's easier, we're still struggling to get there on a 100% level.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed about UK stats is that we have some basic stat like taking things by just looking at the score sheets and things, but even then they're very incomplete, and even tracking who scored which goal can be very difficult at times. Okay, so what packages are currently used? Rags?
Yeah, so I sort of created a package of my own a few times over. At the beginning, I created sort of an Android application to track stats where it's basically a grid format, and every play you enter in, whether it was a goal or not, and whether it was against 0, 1, or 2 bludgers. From that, I've sort of moved on to hopefully tracking more individual stats where it's an Excel spreadsheet and you can enter in details of how the goal was scored in terms of a shot, a assist, a drive, and then you just run a Python script using NumPy, Pandas, XLRead, and that takes all that information and will compute individual stats or a play-by-play.
Nice. Adam?
Yeah, so in terms of in the UK, the number of packages themselves is very limited, and realistically, it's where we, Sam and I, saw the opportunity to actually create something rather than just creating the raw numbers, which is fairly easy but goes over to reams and reams of footage. It's more the key of trying to find where these plays are happening. So a lot of the stuff we're trying to create is using an element of a heat map to it. So with that, you can look at any side without actually knowing too much about the team and getting a fairly good understanding of their play style just by looking at where the actions are taking across on the pitch. So it's as simple as just seeing if the heat map is slightly further up the pitch, you're looking at a more high pressing side. And although that's not actually, it's only one picture and it's something that can be very easily understood regardless of whether you know the technical stuff behind it, it massively breaks down how you could create several different plays to beat a team that previously looked a lot harder to take on.
Cool. Ethan, have you got anything to add for this one?
No, I mean, I think Rags has by far made the best package that we've seen in the US. It's by far the most usable statistics, the kind of most efficiency type based statistics. Generally, other packages have been more of your, workman-like stats, your goals, your assists, which are important. And I think we'll talk about that more, how, statistics have a piece in marketing as well as they do in analytics. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of where packages are, I would say.
Yeah, I'd also like to mention Kinovia, the package, which is kind of you analyze game footage. It puts game footage and you can like circle and highlight and put arrows where things are, which is currently in open source and free to use, which could be very useful for coaching, I found. Okay, so Ethan, what do you think would make the ideal analytics package?
I mean, ideally, I'd want everything, right? But I think it also comes down to a little bit of what hat are you asking me to wear here? If I'm wearing my hat as MLQ co-commissioner, I need a package that I can ideally run a fantasy game off of. That's the most important thing to me. That's going to be your goals, your assists, your turnovers. Your basic stats that you'd see in like a basketball box score, basically. If I had to estimate. Those aren't the stats I need as a coach or as kind of a more advanced analyst of the game. The stats I'm looking for there, probably going to need your efficiency numbers. So your passing efficiency, your shooting efficiency on the beater side, maybe beating efficiency, rate of winning beater exchanges, etc. So it does kind of come differently depending on kind of what scope you're looking from. But yeah, I mean, ideally, I would have a way to kind of track things into the depth that we've started to track some of our other main sports.
Okay, Jay?
Yeah, I completely agree with Ethan. From a marketing point of view, I'm looking for the basketball box score, the stats that look sexy that I can talk and hype players up for. So goals, assists, tackles, turnovers caused, contested shots, things like that. From a coaching point of view, that having those stats beside me is fantastic, but it doesn't really give me anything I don't already know from my players. Whereas if I've somehow, got raw statistics on beta battles, for snitch on pitch versus not on snitch on pitch, or efficiency of contested shots versus uncontested shots, tackle completions versus tackles attempted. Those help me not only understand my players better, but then if I've got areas of the field that those are happening in, it helps me to understand maybe, my keeper's weaker on taking on shots from the left side because they are right-handed or for whatever instance it is. I think that's when the deeper you claw into the stats, the more that you can gain out of it. But I think definitely from a European point of view, any stats that we can get are better than nothing, because we can push those towards the marketing aspect and giving newer teams, maybe less tactically advanced teams, a basic understanding that if they are suffering, 30 turnovers a game, where are they suffering the turnovers, and then what could they do about that? I think stats shouldn't just be something for, the quote unquote elite level, which I hope that I may be aspiring to, but also the base level of player should be able to access stats and gain something from it.
And I will say that a lot of those efficiency stats are a little more difficult to piece together. It does
100%.
take more time. I'd say one of the basic ones, and Rags might push back on this a bit. I don't know how much he's really looked into it. Like basic kind of how efficient players are. Beater side plus minus, I think it has a decent correlation. And it doesn't really work with chasers, because I honestly don't think a single chaser can necessarily affect the scoreline that much. But a dominant beater can affect it in a way that if you're comparing, especially within a team, plus minuses, you're probably going to start noticing some trends that are actually valuable to how you assess players.
So sorry, Sam, I know we're pushed for time, but piggybacking on what Ethan said, the first time that we tried to fully involve stats with Team UK was the European Games 2016, where we collated all of stats by hand live as the game was happening. It was a very primitive approach to it. But by then analyzing those stats after, it helped us to understand with the plus minus in certain times of the game, who was most effective in certain situations. We suffered a few cards. We saw what beta pairs worked best when we were a player down. And we weren't able to dive in fully because at the time, my knowledge wasn't good enough to fully expand upon them. But the more you get into it, as Ethan said, the more it starts to reveal to you. And I think plus minus is a fantastic stat to be able to calculate.
So how can you apply Quidditch analysis better to Quidditch? What is needed, Amanda and Adam? So if we start with Adam, in your experience.
For me, it's an extension of what Ethan and Jay have been on about. The key for me is that stats is not simply an on-off switch. You simply have all the stats or you have none of the stats. To me, it is depending on what level of the sport you're at, and basically from what point of view you want to look at it as. If I want to look at it on a coach, I want to be pressing a few switches, and I want to be looking at quite a lot of in-depth stats, and more specifically where my team is going wrong. But that kind of applies to all teams, really, because for a coach of a lower side, they're still going to commit mistakes. And arguably, this is where it's going to be more valuable, is that it might not be, particularly for a less experienced coach, it might not be obvious what you're doing wrong, but you must be doing something, otherwise you wouldn't be losing. And it's looking at finding a different angle of trying to approach the same problem. And if you can see a clear thing, say, going off our heat map example of, well, if everything's going down this side, does this need to be a change of personnel? Does this need to be a change of style? It can be however much you want it to be. It doesn't necessarily have to be I'm going to use stats or I'm not going to use stats.
Yeah. Amanda?
I think consistency is the biggest one that needs to happen, just because it's so difficult and nearly impossible to make decisions off of data that's just incomplete.
Yeah, definitely. And so kind of building on from Jay and Ethan's point, so how can statistics analysis be used to help coaching and building a team? Jay, start again.
Yeah, I think it's back to what Ethan said, like getting those plus minuses, getting efficiency is really handy when you've sort of got your national team and you're at a tournament. However, from my point of view, if I'm already at World Cup and America's absolutely giving me the business, the stats that are showing me America's giving me the business aren't actually going to help me out that much. However, in maybe prior club games to squad selection, if you can see the efficiency of players at club level, and you can see the areas that they're excelling in, and you can actually compare two players statistically, that is really, really useful. I know a lot of times when it's between two players, every coach sort of has to justify it by going, well, I just know that they're better in this scenario, or from watching them, I can see X, Y, Z. Whereas I think if you've got data in front of you where you can compare two players, that's fantastic. And that's going to help selection. in the same way that obviously, I don't know about the US, but the UK scouting network, and I know across Europe, the scouting network is limited by people power. Whereas suddenly, if I can draw stats from lots of different games, it's going to help me find those players that maybe aren't as well known, that are flying under the radar, that can maybe be those difference makers. Because, you know, we don't have a like development team of 50 people going out finding me the next superstar. But suddenly, if I've got stats and data, yeah, there's going to be dud picks, but it certainly makes my job as a coach easier in trying to uncover some of those talented individuals.
Yeah. So, Rags, have you got anything to add to this?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, because I think while obviously a great coach can use stats very effectively, I think an unskilled coach, there's a huge danger in using stats. And part of the reason I want to bring this up is I was working on stats between these two college teams in one game. And there's a chaser where it is just common sense. And if you watch the game, if you watch film, if you're just part of discussions and you watch her play, she's one of the best chasers in the college game. And if you look at the sort of fantasy stats that like Ethan was saying at the end, or the stats that like MOQ or anyone would collect in terms of individual stats, in terms of how many goals, how many assists, how many turnovers, she had 0 goals, 0 assists, and 3 unforced turnovers in that game. And a sort of untrained coach might look at that and say, well, okay, this player is just terrible. Whereas obviously she isn't. And if you go back and watch the film, you'll notice that in all the situations, her team passed her the ball and then just didn't get open. And I think that ties into a lot of like gameplay issues, where a lot of people use their female and gender nonconforming players as unmarked wings. So they're used to them being like the last pass before a goal or a turnover. And so in these situations where they're passing to her up front, she'd get the ball and there would be no one open. And so when she finally threw a pass, it would end up in a turnover. And so if you are an untrained coach, you get the stat sheet after that, you all of a sudden it's 0-3 in terms of like goals to turnovers. It's horrible, but that is a huge danger. And I'm always hesitant when someone asks me for summary stats of a game to just give it to them like a coach, because there's so much potential for like misusing it. I just think it's there's obviously a lot of potential where if you see a stat that like surprises you, you need to build off of that and actually go back and watch the film and try to figure out, okay, why am I not utilizing this player to her best ability? Or why did this player who I know is good not do so well? Or why did this player who I think is good do bad? And maybe they aren't really that great. Stats, especially those sort of like fantasy stats, should never be the end point of judgment in a player's ability. It's a end judgment in like performance. Like if you're watching Texas last season and you're playing them and you look at your stats and you're like, oh, there was a pass to Casey for a goal at the hoops literally 5 times that game. So clearly like that's a defensive flaw, but they should never be used to make sort of snap judgments on, okay, this player is bad or this player is good. That lies in the film.
Yeah, I think Rags has worded that really well. And I want to stress that I always think stats should be used as an aid, never a decision maker. And I think just to emphasize his point, like using the stats and then watching the film is so important. Like we've had games, just to use another example, where like we've had one of our top keepers has played in a game and statistically has come off as if like he had his hands tied behind his back the whole game, and another player who is much weaker looks like a superstar. So I think it's about making sure you don't cherry pick the stats to fit your own narrative, which I think across all sports is so common. And I think that's like Rag said, the difference between a bad coach and a good coach is looking at the stats and then using them as a building block rather than using the stats as a narrative supporter.
Yeah, definitely. Make sure not to take them from a single game. You need to try and get stats as they build up, which is one of the problems if you have inconsistent stats, is that if you only have a couple of games to work on, you can't really make any inference. What, Ethan?
Yeah, I actually cringed a little when Jay mentioned scouting because I think we are absolutely terrible as a sport at scouting. We are super name brand heavy. We super overrate names that we know. We super underrate names that we don't know. And this works its way all the way up to high level decisions made on in terms of lines, etc. I don't know. I know we have a bit of an international audience. I don't know if this reference falls flat on an international audience. There's a famous movie based on a famous book, Moneyball by Michael Lewis. It's about the Oakland A's, a baseball team from about a decade ago that decided to rely heavily on analytics. There's a really famous scene from it. Brad Pitt's the star of the movie, and he's going at it with his scouts, his kind of old school scouts who think things like, the look of the player or their attitude, et cetera, are the things that matter. And all he cares, for example, in this example, is that the guy gets on base, basically. And I think there's always going to be those opposing things. And I think the good thing about stats is that if you do use them correctly, you can kind of see through those gray areas. The problem is, you guys were mentioning, a lot of people don't understand, but I think it's kind of necessary for us, or whoever's providing the statistics, to kind of make these points. And I actually kind of love to hear from Adam's perspective, because I've had some friends who work in analytics for pro teams in the US. There's a lot of pushbacks, even from coaching staffs. And I wonder if you guys, because I know soccer is kind of getting into analytics almost a little later than some sports. So I'm kind of curious how your coaching staffs are kind of responding to that.
So the opinion on the use of stats remains divisive, not just within each club, but just across the sport. There is so much division depending on some of the clubs. Some clubs have fully utilized it and went, right, this is the direction we're going to go down, and have seen great levels of success. There's actually quite a lot that have gone, right, we're going to commit heavily to stats, and have gone the complete opposite. It was very early on. So although it's an international audience, there's a major club of Liverpool that everyone's heard of. In fact, same owners as the Boston Red Sox. They decided, when they first employed the use of stats, they were going to use very specific stats. It links very heavily to Rags's points of looking at very specific stats to see the overall picture of the game. The key point here was, they were wanting to look at very basic stats of being like, how do we get more goals? It's a very simple thing that could be used in all sports. For them, it was noticing that certain players were able to cross the ball, and therefore certain players were able to score a lot with their head. Now, obviously, we can't do that in Quidditch quite as regularly, but the point still stands of how the way of creating the goals was exactly the same. What they didn't notice was all the other stuff of how they were getting the ball, and the time of wondering, why isn't this working? It's because of all the other stats actually looking behind, is that's all they could do. They couldn't deal with players under pressure. They were really struggled when they were pressed heavily. It's the idea, you have to look at a complete package if you want to use stats as a full-blown thing. You cannot just pick and choose certain statistics and go, yes, that proves my argument. And this is actually a major problem, particularly in UK football and generally the UK media, is that the sport statistics are used to prove a point, but then as soon as it no longer proves their point, stats are rubbish. And that would be I think it's something that people are worried about, of using stats on a more regular basis in all sports. You have to look at a complete package, and watching the film. Even in a pro team, no one looks at just the numbers. Even as a data analyst, I don't just look at the graphs. I have to look at the film. Otherwise, you do not get a full understanding of the game.
So Adam, just building on that, so what do you think are the key indicators of performance that you could measure for Quidditch?
So for me, they can be whatever you want them to be, depending on the goal you are looking to achieve. So overall, it doesn't really matter, to be honest. There's not much more to elaborate on there. Is that you watch the film and you're looking at certain indicators of, I want to understand where I'm leaking goals. You look at certain certain stats. You want to see chance creation, you're going to look at different stats. And it could also depend, the joy of this sport is the use of multiple genders, is that you can potentially then utilize their players in different ways due to the certain statistics, or at least the perception of how you use a player. It can go both ways. You can either use it and say, I'm going to pick different ones, or actually there might be the joy of, actually, if I use the same statistics, no matter who this individual is, you may see the the same level of success. It will depend on each player and each team.
So Rags, have you got anything to add for this?
Yeah, just I agree strongly that it's very dependent on what you want to do. If you want to look at, for example, what plays were most successful against you, what do you need help defending? You look at, okay, where did all the goals come from? What manner were they scored? Who was the scorer? Who was the assist from? Also, there's a lot of stats that they're all useful if you can get them on a regular basis, where that's where a lot of the trouble comes in. Because if you can get beater face-off stats, okay, beater 1 against beater 2, Jackson Johnson against Max Haviland, how many times did they face off? How many times did one beater throw back? How many times did one beater block? How many times was the thrower successful or the defender successful? That would be fantastic. I would love to have those stats about every beater. They are really, really hard to collect, unless that is like your sole goal in an entire game and you're only watching it to collect beater stats. So I think every stat has a usage. Even those like fantasy stats, like I said before, as far as, oh, this guy scored this many goals or so-and-so turned over the ball this many times, they all have a usage. You just need to know how to use them properly and not make bad judgments based off of them.
Ethan?
Yeah, and I love what Adam was saying about how situational it is, because again, we've been talking about this throughout this panel, but there's difference between like media interest in numbers and like a coaching staff interest in numbers. And a coaching staff is always often going to be asking very, very specific questions. I took a sabermetrics class in college, and my entire research paper was literally just on whether how well-known a pitcher was affected the size of their strike zone. This is something that like a coaching staff might need to know, but is not super interesting to like, talk about the players when you're the play-by-play guy for a baseball game on a Saturday at 1 o'clock. I think one thing that we've talked a lot about efficiency stats. The other thing that I think from a coaching staff perspective is really important is tendencies. I know Mitch Cavender, he was the U.S. national team coach in 2014, huge on tendencies, love to study them. One of the things he focused on a lot was ball carriers. What was their tendency to try to get around a point defender? What percent of the time did they go right? What percent of the time did they go left? If your point defender knows that the ball carrier is trying to go around them to the right side 100% of the time, that makes their job so much easier. That's going to make them a more effective defender. Again, this is not necessarily a thing that a random media outlet is necessarily going to spend all their time researching, but finding these tendencies, beaters who throw high versus who throw low, beaters who in exchange throw 0% of the time and always look for the catch, your beaters can exploit that if they know that fact. So these are all tendency statistics can be really useful for a coaching staff.
Yeah,
I'd quite like to jump on that if possible. Is that's one of the main roles that I use as my role at Sheffield United, and it's something that's very much and when I was head of football at York, to me, you're absolutely right. It's not a flashy stat, but you can break down a play style in simply looking at that. But the key thing for me there was not actually that's technically statistics. This is more an advocate for the use of film. And that so I use this on a regular basis on all opposition analysis, is that I can break down any player and go, I can give my players another level of confidence. Yes, it helps them to be able to exploit it, but if they are going into a game knowing exactly how the opponent is going to play, they are going to play so much better. It works on both ways. That didn't necessarily come from the numbers. That comes from looking at X amount of film, and you can go into any game regardless of whether you perceive yourself as a better or worse player than the individual you're going to be against.
So I know that you've mentioned that kind of Rags, you've got your own system. There's also QuidStats and there's our system. So do you think that statistics should be standardized across the sport? And how would you achieve that?
That's that's an interesting question. I think it would be a nice goal. I think certain sort of fantasy type stats can be pretty easily standardized. MLQ uses a similar system to what I use when I take stats for USQ games. They change a few things around, like tracking like turnovers and takeaways, the way they mark them is a little different. And Amanda can speak more on that. But I think having a set of stats that we can all agree, the problem therein lies in the fact that the more generic and more generalized the stats can get, the also like less significant they necessarily are. Like the most interesting stats, if you watch like American football, are those like next gen stats, which like it's just like, oh, that pass had like a 30% chance of completion, or he runs go routes 6% of the time on catches. And those are very interesting stats, and that's where the details are, and that's where like coaches would want, and that's what everyone else would want. Whereas this kind of stats that we would need to standardize would be some things like goals, assists, how do you mark a turnover, a takeaway, that sort of stuff, which is very surface level, but that's what makes it standardizable.
Yeah. So Amanda, could you elaborate more on that?
Sure. Like Regs was saying, when it comes to just the definition of what you define your statistic as, for example, turnovers versus missed shots, shots taken, passes that are missed versus a pass that you didn't catch, and stuff like that, is just, there's quite a variety on how people define it. And even more of a problem is the people taking the statistics may have a different definition. So we specifically for MLQ have a very specific definition of what constitutes a turnover. If the person taking the statistics does not realize that this is the definition, they may be going off of whatever internal definition they're using, and the statistics are no longer consistent.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, Jay.
So I was going to say, like, even that becomes a problem on really obvious things as well. So like an issue we had with QPL stat taking was what constituted an assist. And there was massive arguments within the community, mainly because it robbed me of so many of what constituted an assist. If an assist was a pass that immediately led to a goal, or if a pass and then beating a defender to score still counted an assist. And that was because there were 10 plus people taking these stats in real time and on film that all had a sort of different opinion of what an assist was. And I think this, on what Rags and Amanda have said, like if we can't always get that right, then trying to get, these next gen and deeper stats just gets harder and harder. So I think standardization is definitely the way forward. If we want to be able to compare, even between, teams and leagues, let alone internationally.
I'll give you a quick example of like how hard it is to come to a consensus. I was watching, I think, USA Australia, the bracket play game, or some game was the most recent one. And there's a play in which the driving chaser was hit really hard as he threw, such that like his throw just didn't go far at all. Like it would have been a clean, hard throw, but because he was hit, it just like floated a little bit. And then it landed on the ground next to his teammate, and she picked it up. And like the second she touched the ball, she was beat. So that scenario, who do you give the takeaway or turnover to? Do you give it to the person who made the hit, the person, the beater that beat? Do you mark it as an error, a bad pass by the driving chaser? Like there is so much variety, and that's just like one. I encounter situations like these pretty much every single game. And so having good guides as to this is this, this is this, this is how we take stats is so important.
So what would you say are kind of some of the limits of collecting stats, and how do you mitigate this? I know you've said have some strict definitions for things like tackles and turnovers. Yeah. But how would you, sorry.
No, the limits is literally time. So when I first tried to expand my my stats taking from just was it a goal or not, and what number of bludgers was it against, I decided I'm going to track everything. So so I watched like an MLQ game, and every time there was a beater face-off, I'd write it down, face-off between so-and-so at this time. And then I would write who won, what happened next. Every time there was a substitution on market, every time there was so-and-so, I would try marking it. And a 30-minute real-time MLQ game ended up taking me 5.5 hours of just constant stat taking. That is what happens when you have to take all these stats. And that is just on film where I could rewind and watch it 50 bazillion times. And so it is so important to limit what you do. And so I think one of my ideas and how I've been able to achieve that is the idea of one play or one possession, one play, which is every possession, there's just one idea of what happened. There's a missed pass, a goal, a turnover, takeaway. There's just one way that possession ended. You can go into so much detail about it, right? You can say it was a missed shot, it was wide high. You could say it was a goal on a drive, a goal on a mid-range shot, a goal on the left hoop, right hoop, middle hoop. You can go into so much detail, but as long as there's just one thing you're tracking per possession, even though like technically those are like multiple things, it is so much easier. And MLQs use that to sort of do all the stat taking live. And that's the big thing, because MLQ tried, and Ethan and Man can talk to this, MLQ tried taking stats where we showed people video, and the video wasn't always like great quality, and then you'd have to watch it so many times and they'd end up with like the same problems where they were spending way too much time and it's just exhausting. So that's, I would say, the biggest limitation.
Yeah, you said time. I was going to add two other things. Film, which you said we tried to mitigate by doing things more live. But film, first of all, if you want to get a full season's worth of stats, because note, if you have a full season, you're missing one game. You don't have a full season's worth of stats. You've lost extremely significant data for being able to use those stats for comparison purposes if you lose even one game. So as someone had asked in the question and answers, I actually typed out an answer, but why we've never been able to do a full fantasy season, it's usually one piece of film that gets erased or written over or doesn't get sent or has an error in the file. We never get stats from that game, and suddenly you can never do a full picture of the stats for the league. The other issue with film is resolution, which I think Amanda was talking to a little bit earlier. If everyone looks like a little blob, that adds another 3 hours to what Rags was just talking about, because you need to try to pick out their numbers in whatever frame they look clear enough to be seen in. If the film isn't shot at a good angle, that makes things even harder. And that kind of plays into familiarity, which is the other thing I was talking about, where if a stat taker knows the teams, it is so much easier to take stats because you're not tracking numbers. You recognize faces, which makes it so much easier when you're jotting these things down. I will say the one limitation to live, as Rags was talking about, is live, you can basically do a decent facsimile of chaser stats. It gets very limiting in what you can get out of beaters when you're doing it live. Yeah.
This is what me and Adam have had difficulty in, that it's very difficult to get statistics in a timely manner with things, especially when you've got bad quality footage. But so kind of moving on to our final section is, how do you think analytics can improve the sport? Amanda?
I think the initial one should be, or would be, the marketing benefit, just getting a box score, being able to promote that. And I think in turn, having something like that, which would increase people's interest in statistics, would lead to better, more in-depth statistics. Once we have something that people say, hey, that's cool, look at these cool stats that we got after this tournament, you're gonna be like, what else can we do? So the more people that are interested in it, the better statistics we're going to end up getting in the future.
Yeah, so I agree. It's very much kind of a marketing thing in the shortest of terms. I mean, we can talk about all the analytical applications from a coaching perspective, but baseball is basically propped up as a sport right now in the US because, trust us, I mean, nobody in our generation likes baseball that much. I like baseball, but a lot of people don't. It's basically propped up by its record book. Like, its record book remains relevant, and that's kind of what stories in the sport are written on. I mean, we can't do that at all in Quidditch. Like, we don't really have individual record books. I mean, we have some basic things like championships run, but we basically have nothing else. The other thing, we've kind of talked about this throughout, is is a real fantasy system. You know, I happen to also follow League of Legends. I'll follow any sport that's kind of the rub on me. But I follow Pro League of Legends, and this year the North American version pumped really hard their fantasy system, and they kind of revamped it and made it kind of a nice UI, etc. And the fantasy league I'm in, there are multiple people who have never really followed League of Legends who are in this league and who kind of follow now on a week-to-week basis purely because of this fantasy system. Fantasy, the reason football is the biggest sport in the US is because fantasy football is the biggest thing in the US, in my opinion, at least. So it is really important to have a fantasy system working, and that's the value of having statistics.
So Jay, I know you've got quite some strong opinions on the use of statistics in social media. Could you elaborate on that further?
Yeah, so like for me, there's two ways I approach the sport, which is like the very serious tactical analytics side for Team UK and club. But the other side is like we come to Quidditch for the narrative, for the good time, for the show. And the way I think about it, like when you go and watch a boxing match, which I'm sure many Quidditch players are very interested in, you go and watch it for the show, for the narrative, for the storyline. And by having these statistics, you can manufacture the storyline, you can manufacture the hype, you can manufacture the show. Because if I can suddenly have a sideline, you know, a side-by-side comparison of the two top keepers who are going to be slugging it out, or the two best beaters and their statistical records, and I can compare that and advertise that. That for me is a way that people can tangibly interact with these great players rather than just going, you know, Oggy Monroe, he's really good, isn't he? We can go, Oggy Monroe, he's really good, isn't he? Oh, wow, look at that stats. He scored, you know, 1,000 goals versus the UK. What an absolute hero. And then the other application of that is with the fantasy. As Ethan was saying, like we've got a tournament planned that has that fantasy aspect. You're going to get buy-in from everyone. Like there's many tournaments I go to where I'm actually not bothered about who's playing or the result. But suddenly if I've got this fantasy aspect where what's going on in this game actively affects me, that's going to make me engage. Fantasy is a great thing for advertising. Who was the highest fantasy scorer? Who was the sleeper pick? You know, all of these things create engagement. They create conversation in Quidditch. And I think we're at a point now where the conversation is led by the same 10 people going, oh, what do we think of this? What do we think of this? Whereas people can manufacture their own discussion about, oh, who have you got in your fantasy team? Have you seen the stats for X, Y, and Z? Didn't they do well? Oh, have you seen the stats for so-and-so in fantasy? Maybe they'll get the call up to the national team. And I think it just allows so much more buzz and conversation from the stats to be applied in marketing and media. Like stats don't have to be boring. You can use marketing to make the stats sexy and get people to engage with them.
So I want to piggyback on that with something. It's not necessarily like statistics and social media related, but it's just about the conversations that we're having about the sport in general and the types of conversations and the fact that high level analytics conversations really shape the legitimacy of the sport, right? So if you're having a conversation and you don't have any stats to back it up, like Jay said, it's a weird conversation because it's completely subjective. Something in undergrad, my stats advisor or my professor told me that really stuck with me throughout all my Quidditch analysis is there's no such thing as a bad analysis. There's just undescriptive analysis. And that's kind of like a weird way to phrase it. But the idea is, even if you have a completely incorrect take, even if it's something like, you know, Augustine Monroe is the best keeper in the world because he has such a great ability to play wing chaser, which is no, like I've never seen Augustine Monroe play a wing chaser role. But if you're that descriptive, you can look at film and be like, you're out of your mind. Show me a point where he plays wing chaser well. Whereas if you just use the same like trite words that literally everyone on this panel has used at some point in their life, you're like, he's very athletic. It's horrible. I've used it and it's a very bad habit, and all of us try our best not to do that. But I mean, you can't argue against that. Like, of course he's athletic. But it's those descriptive roles saying, I think he is good because he is so great at catching bludgers. And then you can have a discussion, say, hey, is catching bludgers really that useful of a stat in Quidditch? Are there better things? There are people who've been great at catching, and that's pretty much all they could do in the sport. And that's what limited them into becoming a great beater, for example. And when you get to that level of precision, you know, there is no such thing as a bad analysis anymore, because you have the description, you have the means, if you have the stats or the film, to prove it right or wrong. Or it becomes a question about, is the stat important, rather than just an undescriptive analysis and, oh, they're fast. I mean, what does that have to do with anything, really? Or, oh, they're athletic or physical or whatever. I mean, like, I get that. Give me something concrete, and then we can tell about how I should use them, or how good they are, or when I would use one good athletic player over another good athletic player, because they're not all interchangeable. And so that is something, the idea that there's no such thing as a bad analysis, just an undescriptive one, is just something that stuck with me a lot. And I think stats is great at shaping that and making it so that all your conversations are very to the point.
So we've only got 2 minutes left, so we're going to have to start wrapping up. But has anyone got any other final points they'd like to mention?
I guess I was just kind of combing the questions while Rags was answering there. And Michael O'Connor was asking, what's the Moneyball stats that you think our current baseline stats are missing or unable to collect currently that could be a huge indicator of skill in future data collection? And I think what's fun about this, and I think really kind of the central narrative of, or the central through line of what we've talked about, is we inherently don't know, right? If we knew, we would be abusing them already. But it kind of takes that very situational type, look to figure these things out. For all we know, teams that, score 80 and 90% of the time against when the other team's down one chaser or something like that could be this massively affecting thing. Players who are, chasers who are tackled rarely, that could be the number one thing, the fact that people can't tackle them effectively. Or it could be way smaller things than that. It could be beaters who are, less prone to throwing more than 5 yards away from themselves or something like that. But we don't know. And that's why it's so cool that we can hopefully start to go forward as film gets better, as more people are interested. We love that so many people are kind of following along today, to kind of figure those things out, figure out what the on-base percentage of Quidditch is.
Cool. Adam, have you got anything to add, or Amanda, just finally?
No, Ethan has perfectly summed it up. There is a reason that data collection of any variety is a multi-million dollar industry in any sport. Like, there's nothing, no sport has got it right. Reading through the messages, and maybe I'm sitting this with a very much a UK head on, baseball does not have it absolutely spot on. Let me make that perfectly clear. But neither does Quidditch, and we're some way off from doing it. And that's okay. Just because we're sat here having a chat being like, well, we think we've got a pretty good idea and we've got some idea. If there's another stat that people go, why haven't they mentioned this? Please go and find it out yourself and tell us, because it would be very useful to know.
Sure.
Cool. Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up there as it is 20 past. So thank you for everyone coming. Hope you've enjoyed it. And I think we will be all planning on going into Slack and answering the questions afterwards, the people who haven't got around to answering. So, right. Thank you very much.
Take care.